Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about All Dogs Go to Heaven from 1989. And this is the winner of the Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below and pledge, and maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. All Dogs Go to Heaven comes at the end of a big period for Don Bluth and his various animation studios. After having two big hits and besting Disney both of those times, with American Tail making more than The Great Mouse Detective in the same year, and then Land Before Time making more than Oliver and Company on the same weekend, besting it for several weekends actually, even though Oliver and Company would make more overall, but still, they showed that another animation studio could not only successfully make animated features, but do better than Disney. And that was a big deal in the 80s. That was a big deal in the history of animation. And then we get to All Dogs Go to Heaven. Now, before you go, you should talk about the movie, not the box office performance and so forth. There is a point I'm trying to make. All Dogs Go to Heaven, when it came out the same day as The Little Mermaid on November 17th, 1989, it got totally destroyed by The Little Mermaid, it making tons more money, and despite this having a major movie star, Burt Reynolds, in a performance that very much feels like a Burt Reynolds movie. The difference between this and Little Mermaid are pretty striking, and there's a lot of similarities between the difference between this and Little Mermaid and the differences between Land Before Time and Oliver and Company, and the success that both Land Before Time had over its competitor, Oliver and Company, and Little Mermaid had over this, are quite similar actually. Now I'm going to say something that might be controversial, but I think All Dogs Go to Heaven is a better animated film than The Little Mermaid. The animation is striking, it's beautiful, it's amazing, it's Don Bluth at the top of his game, and it's a glorious thing to look at. Is it a better story than The Little Mermaid? No. And it's not as clear as The Little Mermaid either. And that's sort of the problem. When I'm watching this film, the story goes so quickly. You get introduced to things, you have character moments, you have musical sequences. Like, it doesn't even feel like you're in some sort of the same movie. And I know there's certain deleted scenes, but reading about those, I was like, those aren't enough that they would have changed or bettered this film. Now, I still think this is a good movie. It's almost a miracle sometimes this works in terms of all the weird storytelling decisions that they constantly make. Whether it's like, having musical sequences that don't really add anything, or it's like changing tone and perspective, having an opening that like sorta is there to set them up, but then like they never have quiet moments like that again, so why would you do that necessarily? Showing off this whole world, which they do effectively, but almost getting to plot points almost too quickly. It doesn't let you kind of ruminate on certain things, and then like shifts focuses and shifts all these things. It really works, and it works despite like all the weird things it's doing throughout it. Like, it totally changes and introduces the girl character after he comes back from heaven. And reading, like, I don't know how many story writers do they have. It's like, even though the only credited screenwriter is David N. Weiss, but 10 story by credits is quite a lot, and you can kind of tell like there's maybe too many cooks in the kitchen. All Dogs Go to Heaven is of course about Charlie, who dies and is killed by his kind of business partner, Carface, and decides he wants to come back and get revenge on him. He finds a way to get out of heaven, which no one's ever done, but this dog voiced by Burt Reynolds did it, which, sure. And then so he comes back from heaven and is going to get revenge, but then finds out the way he's like fixing kind of the races. He has a little girl who talks to animals. And so Charlie decides to basically kidnap this little girl who doesn't have parents or anything, but pretends like he's going to free her, and then uses her to make lots of money with his friend Itchy, who's voiced by Dom DeLuise. And of course, the little girl, Anne Marie, is voiced by Judith Barcy in her final performance. And he uses this little girl to get more money and to succeed and to get revenge on Carface and open his own place and all this stuff. In some ways, the film totally shifts after he dies and becomes less about Carface, but sort of is about Carface, and more about him and his relationship with this little girl, which is more about his redemption arc. And there's an alligator singing and all that stuff. I don't think this was the tightest screenplay and is overly complicated, and is almost more about how awesome flowing the animation is. Now, the reason I brought up The Little Mermaid competing with it is The Little Mermaid, I think, is a very simple story. Simple in that you totally know what's going on at all times. There's never a doubt that you understand that story whatsoever. It's always completely and utterly clear in what's going on. I would say the same thing about Don Bluth's previous film, The Land Before Time. There's not much to be confused by. It might confront you with major issues or something like that. But as a story, it's simpler, it's clearer. Oliver and Company has the same problem as this, because there's way too much going on. I'm not necessarily compelled by it. Both have to do with like dogs and orphans in major cities in America. I think it is interesting that the Oliver and Company Land Before Time thing was such a moment in animation, and then when you get to All Dogs Go to Heaven and Little Mermaid, he gets bested by doing the thing they did that he beat them at previously. It's such a weird thing. Now, I will say, I think this is a better movie than Oliver and Company, particularly because they use the star persona of Burt Reynolds. Like, it's one thing to just cast celebrity in your movie, but like, this is a role that Burt Reynolds and Dom DeLuise were already doing. They're already buddies and stuff. This feels like Burt Reynolds and Dom DeLuise put into a Don Bluth movie in all that kind of star persona kind of thing. And in that way, it's actually sort of really interesting. Instead of, most celebrity voices, it's like, oh, this would be good for this celebrity and enhance this character. They're not thinking of it like a star vehicle like typically you would at the time. And in some ways, this is sort of like that, which I thought was like really natural. It kind of like they met halfway, and I think it worked really well. It is a lot more interesting than Oliver and Company, which has a lot of bad songs and stuff. This does have bad songs, but honestly, the songs didn't stick out to me as much, frankly. That might be surprising, and this film is very weird and like strange, and like everything it's going, like just describing it, I'm like, so the dog gets a girl who can talk to all animals, but like they never get into that, and she wants parents, and you get some influences from Mr. Bug Goes to Town to Fantasia throughout it. It's really like really out there, and I've heard of all sorts of people like complaining about the story. Apparently, according to various things I read on the internet, Robert Towne tried to simplify it, so it seems like this was the thing that they were trying to do. This story about a dog was something Don Bluth had wanted to do for years and years, but Robert Towne tried to simplify it. I don't want to know what the unsimplified version of this is. Supposedly, I've read some places Spielberg gave notes, but they had a creative falling out. But from Don Bluth, it sounds like this was developed separate from that, so that might not be true. I do enjoy this film. It was a little bit a part of my childhood, more so on VHS, where this film did do well. It was kind of like his last big movie until Anastasia. It seems like the rest of the 90s, like none of those really permeated, even on VHS, which is sort of weird because I remember as a kid just like going through that kids section, no matter what it was. It really didn't matter to me, and it's kind of scary and a little sad that like Rockadoodle and Thumbelina and the rest were just kind of forgotten. But this, I do have pleasant memories about it, and it was sort of a weirder, odder film. It doesn't have the other three of his films, I think, of a storytelling clarity that I don't really get with this. And I think that's kind of its biggest problem, but I think the performances of the three leads really bring this together, mostly because Burt Reynolds and Dom DeLuise have performances and personas that are fully formed, at least in their minds, so the weakness of the script doesn't really matter because it's like, oh, I know Burt Reynolds from like Smokey and the Bandit. If this is 1989, most modern audiences are going to know what a Burt Reynolds movie is, you know what I mean? They're like, oh, Cannonball Run, yeah, I'm halfway with you there, guy, I get it. So I think a lot of the heavy lifting, this film gets away with a lot because of the beauty in the animation. Obviously, the dogs are animated like more cartoony and the people are more realistic. Anne Marie is supposedly based on Snow White by Disney. This is sort of interesting that this is, the animation looks so much more complex and complicated, but is able to say so much more with certain pan shots. Like it's really interesting, the opening where you understand the betting, how they bet with meat and not money because they don't have access to money, and then later he has to find a way to get money, and like there's a lot of little things they set up in this world that are really actually pretty smart, but it almost has like both too much faith in the audience and not enough clarity to really sell it. There's a lot that goes on in this movie. It was almost PG because of the hell scenes and various other deleted scenes. I do agree, and I watch Animat's video, and he brings up the Tommy gun thing, which they refer to as kind of just like a kid's little play gun. I forget, I think they call it like a Flash Gordon ray gun or something. And I was a little like, why are they playing this up? Like when I watched it, I hadn't watched his review, and when I watched the movie, I thought with the ray gun thing, I just went, why is this movie playing it up so much? Why is this movie playing it like this is a serious moment? Because like clearly they're not going to hurt Charlie. Like they just think that like that's a comedic moment, if anything. And it was pretty clear, like, yeah, they redubbed it, but him like with the gun, and then he like, it's not a Tommy gun, but then he gets hit. Like, that confuses me, what happened with that sequence, and I would actually like some clarification on that at some point, because it just seems odd. Burt Reynolds plays off Judith Barcy so well, and she does I really liked her as I really liked her as an actress, even as a kid. And it was sad to find out when I was much older what had happened to her. And this film is dedicated to her, but I think she gives a great performance. It kind of makes me wish she had gotten to be in more Don Bluth stuff and continue as a voice actress, because I think she's really great. I like her a lot in Land Before Time, but I think this is maybe her best performance, which is very sad. I think All Dogs Go to Heaven, especially like the flow of everything, this is much more of a animator's movie than Little Mermaid, because this is more about the flow of the animation and like showing off these like cool backgrounds and bringing in crazy characters. But I mean, that whole thing with the alligator, they sort of get it to work later, but I don't really think it needed to necessarily be in there. I wish this film was like simplified even more than it is. I remember the All Dogs Go to Heaven animated series, which frankly, like when watching this, I was like, yeah, this film has enough like of a rich world that you definitely could do that, and kind of made me curious like if that's any good, which I saw it like when it aired, but I haven't not seen it since. I do think All Dogs Go to Heaven is not up to par with his other animated classics from the 80s, and if I was seeing this then, I would kind of wonder, like, is he maybe losing his touch a little bit? And I guess where this is in his filmography, you can kind of see a turn for the worse, because everything after this for a little bit is pretty awful. I think it's almost because, like, you know, he worked with bigger people in Hollywood, and it seems like that worked out with American Tail and Land Before Time, which were big cultural hits. This still was a big hit, and I think like a lot of it sort of worked out for him, but it seems like it worked. It just like, it's one of those things where I'm watching a movie and I feel like it could absolutely fall apart at any time because it doesn't have a strong structure on it or anything. And if the wind blows it a little too much, it'll just completely fall over into pieces. I sometimes like movies like that, you know, where it's just like, how did this all get together and work? And I feel that in All Dogs Go to Heaven, but I sort of like that about it, frankly. It is a little scarier, weirder kids film, which I think is why people gravitated to it, as Disney got a lot more traditional, doing like mostly princess and like fairy tale stuff during the Disney Renaissance. You have Don Bluth doing like, hey, All Dogs Go to Heaven, which is like kind of completely left field. It is a fairly decent film, which is still a good movie. I don't think it is like really up there with Land Before Time, and frankly, I haven't revisited it much since my childhood, and anytime I've seen just happened to on it when it's on HBO Kids or whatever channel, I've never really been as compelled by it. I think in many ways, like, there's some moments that play a little better than American Tail and play better than the later stuff, but I think, you know, when we're thinking of like the greatness of Don Bluth, it's like how good he is at complex storytelling and everything like that. And I think in some ways this film, like with Secret of Nim or with Land Before Time, and how he's able to tell like this complex, all these things going on in a very simplified way that's like very clear, and like he has a narrative like theory behind why he's doing it. And this, it's like, I don't think he thought of that as much, like, but I still like this movie. It really, like, feel like he's like losing why Secret of Nim and Land Before Time really worked. He's more thinking on this crazy world that he's created, and should he be proud of that crazy world? Absolutely, because it's pretty dense and pretty awesome. And the animation in this, like I've said, is like much more detailed and much more interesting than The Little Mermaid. Not that I think the animation is bad necessarily, but I think this like really like goes out there with like crazy sequences, amazing like kind of backgrounds, dream sequences, going to heaven and hell. I mean, it's pretty insane everything they're trying to do with it, and I think it is a lot more ambitious than that film. I think the reason Little Mermaid is remained a classic versus this film is kind of points out its narrative weaknesses, is that it doesn't really necessarily have all that clarity. It kind of works because of Burt Reynolds and Dom DeLuise and Judith Barcy. It works because Don Bluth hasn't fully left that clarity. I'd say he's able to kind of like piece it together and get it to work, but it really feels like something that barely made it out the gate, being as decent as it is. And it's almost like you barely got the report in after working all weekend when you hadn't done anything, you had 6 months to do it or something, and it comes out as an amazing piece of art, and you're just like, whoa, I don't know how that happened, but it worked. And that's kind of how this film feels with All Dogs Go to Heaven, and it's sort of Charlie's attitude, to be honest. So maybe, you know, maybe the structure of the film is very Charlie itself, which is appropriate, I guess. I don't know if this is definitely up there for me, maybe up there because of the lacklusterness of the films that preceded it for the most part, but I still have pleasant memories of this, and it was just a beautiful animated film to watch. And I think it showcases, if anything, Don Bluth as an animator and Don Bluth as a visual storyteller, because this film would be much more of a mess if you're just left with the screenplay. They get highlights kind of the problems Don Bluth would have later, the storytelling and so forth, while also kind of showing how great of an animator and a visual storyteller that he really was. So if you have seen All Dogs Go to Heaven and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.